Okay.
Okay, that took a minute, so hopefully we have a good connection today. This is Dive into World Building. And today we're talking about grammar. And I always feel really kind of funny talking about grammar because grammar is one of my favorite things. And I don't mean prescriptivist grammar. So we're not going to be talking about whether it should be fewer or whether it should be less and that kind of stuff. That's not what we're about here. So we're actually going to try to talk about what grammar is actually for and how it can help you in your world building. So, I don't know. The person who suggested this, I believe, was Dale Ivan Smith, who asked me to talk about adjective order. And to be honest, I don't know how to talk about adjective order. Basically, adjective order is this thing where typically you'll have adjectives and they'll come in a certain order. You know, the big brown house. You won't say the brown big house. It just doesn't sound right, right? And so I suppose that one of the things you could do is if you really wanted to make everybody go, woo, you could like mess up your adjective order, and then you'd have the sense that we're not in Kansas anymore. But to be honest, I think there's a lot more going on in grammar that is not about adjective order. You know, grammar basically has lots and lots and lots of little finicky things going on. But a lot of them are actually very meaningful, and then particularly meaningful in a social capacity. And so that's why I think it's relevant to world building, because effectively, like, if I were to ask you, what is grammar for? You guys have a sense of what it would be for?
Making your sentences make sense?
I was going to say it facilitates communication, but
Yeah. So this was the example that was given to me in a class that I took at one point, which was really, really wonderful. If you're looking at a doctor and a nurse, and they're standing over a person who's undergoing surgery, and the doctor needs a scalpel, what does he say?
scalpel.
He says, scalpel, and the nurse hands it to him, right? I mean, we've all seen that, right? We've all been watching House or whatever it is. There's no grammar there. That is a single word, and it's getting a job done. Why is it getting a job done? Because everything about the context is controlled. Okay? So when everything about the context is controlled, you don't need to use as much grammar. All right? So the further away you get from context, the more grammar you have to use. Right? And so, like, not only in the doctor and nurse situation, not only is the doctor in a situation and knows what the situation is, and the nurse also is in the same situation and knows what the situation. They both know what they're supposed to be doing. They know what their roles are in the situation, right? And if the doctor says scalpel, the nurse knows what he has to do, right? It's like all of this stuff has been previously established. It's tied down, okay? So why do we need grammar? Well, grammar is what allows us to move away from context. And so in a sense, when we're writing fiction, and in particular when we're world building, grammar is one of our greatest, most powerful tools. Because grammar is what lets you know what conditions exist in the environment that are not like the ones that you are currently experiencing right now. And so, essentially, I mean, it's a, right? I mean, all of a sudden, with grammar, we can say things in the past tense. We can talk about things that are distant from us, not only in space, but also in time, right? The more distant, the more grammar. So, yeah. There are other things that grammar does as well. It doesn't just locate you, though it does locate you spatially, and it does locate you temporally. It also locates you socially.
Yeah.
And when you locate yourself socially, that's not necessarily straightforward. So there's a whole other, there's a whole other bunch of stuff that we do. And what you find is if you're researching how people talk in social situations, you kind of have to go and record them in social situations. You can't just say, well, you're in this social situation. Imagine that you're in this social situation. What do you say? Because if you tell a person to go and imagine themselves in a social situation and ask them what they will say, what they say is not what they would say if they were in that circumstance. It's what they think they ought to say if they were in that circumstance. So one of the things that happened when people were still first studying pragmatics is they ran into this research problem, right? Because it's easy as pie to do research and say, what would you say if you were in this context? And people go, oh, I'd say this. And okay, great, we've learned so much, right? Except that then you have these people who go out with these actual recording devices and they put the person in that situation. That's not what they say. It's a very there are subtle differences in what they say because they're not actually in the context. So, yeah. So I'm going to pick up Morgan Smith's question for a second. Morgan is back on Big Brown House versus Brown Big House. Yeah. Well, people have done a lot of studying of language. I'm trying to figure out how to explain this here. People have studied language a lot, and they go, okay, language is made up of individual words, and these words are put together in these sentences by people using rules. Okay, and that was the predominant view for a really long time. But it's actually more complicated than that. People don't just have a dictionary in their heads and a set of rules and then just kind of slot things in. They've got this really cool neural net in there. And so what will actually happen is that the neural net will clump up phrases and patterns. And so actually there are some words that you will only say in X context. And not only in just X physical, social context, but also in that particular phrase. One of the examples would be like idioms, right? Let the cat out of the bag, right?
Right.
But if you weren't letting the cat out of the bag and you were letting the moose out of the bag, the idiomatic meaning just wouldn't hold up. So that's a specific idiomatic example, but it actually holds true for a lot more than just idioms. So we tend to put things in contexts, and we tend to speak in particular phrases. And what I notice, for example, is like one of the reasons why I tend to call my kids by the wrong name is not because I've forgotten who they are, but it's because I've suddenly said a phrase that I very often say in the context of saying it to one child, and I happen to be saying it to the other child at that time.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden the other child's name comes out because I'm just on my little internal script there. The neurons are doing their thing. And then I go, oh, shoot, different context.
My mom does that, except she'll go through like this whole list of like everyone she knows until she gets to like the right person.
Yeah.
She'll like start off and it'll be like Roger Vivian Che, and I'm like, it's me. You're talking to me. She goes through like the whole like this list, and it's like, oh god.
Well, I mean, so it's an interesting question, right? Is that really a problem of, and this is actually one of the things that's most interesting, I think, about language, is that people, sometimes we think about language in terms of what's being said and what it's doing, and other times we think about it in terms of what's being said and how it's being said. And what I mean by that, let me write this down for a second. So very often, when parents correct children on their grammar, right? Say you have a child who's learning how to make past tense forms, right? And the pattern that the child has learning the past tense forms is they start by memorizing them all. And they just get them all, and they're all correct. And their performance on past tense forms is fantastic. And then all of a sudden one day, they start making all of them regular ED forms and misforming all these words. And basically what's happened is they've suddenly realized there's a pattern. Oh my gosh, there's a pattern. I can make a past tense of anything. And all of a sudden they're overplaying this rule because they just realized it exists, right? And so they're going to add ED to everything. And then from there they're going to have to rememorize all of the non-regular forms. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So if you're correcting a child and you're correcting them on the way that they're forming their words, they're not going to get it because they're focused on what they're saying. Like, if they're mispronouncing something, they're calling I'm trying to think of a good example. If you're calling a sandwich a pommel, for example, that was something that happened in our house, and you said, no, it's a sandwich, and they say, of course it's a pommel, because you're both talking about the same thing, right? This is a sandwich. Are we disputing whether this is a sandwich? No, we're not. Which word is being used, but there's no doubt in anybody's mind that this is a sandwich. So, anyway, so these are some of the things that can go on. But I'm not trying to give a lecture on language acquisition. So let's try to see if we can apply this to world building. Okay? So I'm going to take a look in my chat here. We should do a hangout on idioms. I'm going to just write that down right now. That can be our next topic if you would like. That sounds great. Glenda's thinking about big house as a slang term for prison. Yes, okay, so things will start to clump together, and then they'll start becoming exceptions to rules. So,
even though we'd say big house is 2 words,
Yeah.
In another conceptual way, big house is a single unit, a single
Right.
entity.
And sometimes you can tell just by the way it's stressed whether it's one or the other. So, for example, if I were to say, look at the White House, that would mean where the president lives. If I don't want to mean where the president lives, I have to say, look at the White House. Okay? So there's a stress pattern there that indicates whether it's become a mental conglomerate or not. And so, I don't know, big house, big house. I don't know if that's actually something that has actually happened or whether it's just White House is so well ingrained, but it does happen with more than just the phrase White House.
Yeah.
So,
I was thinking that if you have about the brown big house thing, which is, I keep coming back to that, but if you have a neighborhood where all of the houses are big, so then you would just drop big, because that's where it would go. Well, it depends on the context, but then you're standing about around. Yeah.
So this actually is great because you're giving me a super segue right into what I want to talk about. So what we're talking about with what Morgan was just saying is, what is normal? And I know this is something I bring up in Hangouts a lot, but it's huge for world building, okay? What is normal? Things that are normal are not going to be explained. So if you're in a situation where every house is big, nobody's going to remark on how big the houses are, right? I mean, you can pretty much guarantee if I have a friend who's coming here to visit me from Japan, they're going to come into my house and they're going to go, oh my gosh, your house is so big. But my house isn't big, because big is a relative term. What big means depends on what you're used to, right?
Yeah.
And so the normal will not be spoken about. That what is not normal is what they call marked. The marked stuff will be talked about. And so if you're trying to have a character who is grounded in a world, it's very important, especially if you're trying to do a very deep internal point of view, that you think about what is normal to them on a lot of levels. And I'm not even just talking about what can I say? Some people will gesture at, oh my gosh, this is not normal to me. But it won't be done the way that a person would actually do it in the context.
Yeah.
So there is that same kind of discrepancy between what you think you should say and what you actually would say in a context. So trying to think of what a good example would be. Something that a person's never seen before is far more likely to be spoken about. New things, right? Changes, that's one of the reasons why changes are so important at the start of a story. Changes from the norm, right? Because if everything's normal, then why do you have any reason to go on an adventure, right? So back in the day, back when I was writing cold words and I was trying to come up with a way to enter this world in an alien point of view, one of the things that I thought about was how to give my character the opportunity to talk about things that he would otherwise consider normal. And the way that you do that is by changing something, okay? And so what you do, what I did, in fact, is I put my human character in the scene. The human character enters the scene, and all of a sudden, Ruli has a reason to think about why the things he's doing are normal or not normal, because he's looking after somebody who doesn't know the rules, right? So putting in a contrasting character, allows you to talk about the normal, right? Because it may not be normal to the other one. And one of the most useful little tools in grammar, because remember, we're talking about grammar here, one of the most useful grammatical tools for talking about things that are familiar versus things that are not familiar is articles.
Oh, that's where you were going.
Yeah, yeah. They're really small, and they're incredibly useful because every time that you say a man entered the room, you're saying to the person who's listening or reading, this item is new. So if you then wanted to say something about the man who walked into the room, you would have to change your article, because then it would have to be the man. Right? And if you didn't, then people would say, there's yet another guy coming into the room? Really? Right? Because A is just, you know, A is for things that are new. Here, I'm introducing a new thing to your list of things that you have to keep track of in the scene. and then after that, we're going to track it with the, so that you know that that's the one that we were working with. And actually, this brings up yet another interesting little thing. There is kind of a hierarchy of how you order the way that you refer to things or people in a scene. Okay? You know, the first thing you'll probably do is describe them with the article a. The second thing you'll do is likely. This is obviously not tied down and always the same, but the next thing you'll do is probably refer to them with the. Okay? Now, if it's for example, a character who's going to become more important, and you're going to see them again, and you don't just want to keep track of them for this particular scene, you have a couple of options. You can start referring to them with a name, but then you have to give the person a way of learning that name. Or you can give them a key phrase.
The tall man, the fat man.
The man with the wart on his nose, you know, or Janice will tend to do something like she'll start calling a person, you know, she won't have her character call the person the tall and skinny man. She'll start calling him tall and skinny.
Yeah.
So, tall and skinny went over there, and right, and it depends. It depends on how closely you're going to need to track that person in the future, and whether those two people will actually be engaging in a social interaction in which knowing the name will be critical, because you can always have a person learn somebody else's name indirectly rather than introducing themselves. You know, so for example, I have a character walking up to a group of other people who are talking amongst themselves, right? And I can, when they first show up, I'm talking about them with, there was a boy who was this, and there was a boy who was that, and the boy who was this did this, and the boy who did this was that, right? So we've gone already from A to the. But then the boys start talking amongst themselves, and one of them refers to another one by the name. And I go, okay, now my observing character can call that kid the boy called Rain, right? That's now permitted because I'm tracking the amount of information that my observing character has, and that gets reflected in the grammar.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anyway, So there is that, and then if for some reason these sequences tend to like to go in a particular direction, and if you then go backwards up them, it can sound kind of weird. If you have a character who started out as a man and then became the man and then became George, if you then go back to the man, it seems really bizarre, right? And that's a pragmatic thing about a pragmatic thing. So for example, you want to be giving as much information as is necessary at any given time, and no more than that, and no less than that, right? So if you've established that his name is George, and then you suddenly start calling him the man again, it's going to sound really odd, because you're ignoring a piece of information that you gave the reader and you're expecting them to use, or you gave the character at least, and you're expecting them to use. Now, if another character then comes in, all bets are off, because that character's point of view is going to be different, and that person may not have ever seen this person before, or may know this person by his title, or may know this person as a relative, right? And so now we're getting into appellations, and what you call people. But I think that's actually one of the really important things is when you have people moving through a scene, what do you call them? That's a grammatical consideration as far as I see it. Thoughts? I am writing down notes.
You're good.
Well, this is going to be a really weird one because I'm doing lots of talking, and so it means it's very hard for me to write things down. So we end up with a very short summary of the discussion. Yeah. Okay. So then the other thing that I'm seeing over here is accents, and I think it's worth talking about.
Yeah, because I mean, if you're trying to write something in, if you need a character to come from a particular background, that's you have to write the sentences, so you got to make it different somehow. So.
Well, precisely, and so there are a lot of different ways to do that. My least favorite is trying to sight spell.
Oh yeah, no, everybody hates that stuff.
Because when somebody says gonna, they think they're saying going to inside their head.
Well, and I think, in fact, that writing gonna as gonna, there is a spelling for gonna. It's not. Yeah.
I actually use that.
Yeah, that's not a great example, but.
Well, yeah. But I mean, like.
Well, I've seen people like write out. Like say a Scottish accent.
The dialect is problematic.
What?
Yeah. Well, if you're attempting to reflect somebody's pronunciation in the way you spell, it can be very insulting. Because there's a long history of that being done with, for example, Black American English, and that's ugly stuff when you go back and you look at how it was done and why it was done. And psycholinguistically, and I'm gonna try to keep it very, very theoretical here because it's worth knowing about. Any word that we hear brings with it every context in which we've ever heard it. Every time you hear it, it will activate like every context in which you've ever heard it. But the ones you've heard more often will be activated more, right? And so two people will hear the same word and have a different pattern of activation, but they'll probably share a lot of contexts, right? And so one of the reasons why I really don't recommend trying to spell out dialects is because it has a long history of being used in racially charged derogatory contexts, right? And so you can try to do it without bringing that context with it, but you're going to have a hard time. So, fortunately, there are a lot of other ways to approach it. One of my favorite things, and this is obviously grammar considered loosely, right? But one of my favorite things for dialects is meter, where the stress falls. Shakespeare had this cool thing going where he kind of grasped that English is naturally iambic. It tends to fall into a pattern of da 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 da, and so iambic pentameter was this really interesting poetic way of capturing speech that sounded pretty normal, right? Morgan, I'm going to have to come back to that, okay?
Okay.
So you can change your meter to make somebody's speech sound like it's from a different region. Example. I need to find an example. So when one of my characters wakes up after he's had the fever, and everybody's worried about him, and one of the servants says, "Oh, you know, young master, we're so pleased that you are feeling better, and this, and you know, tell us if you're all right or whatever." And then there's another servant who would say, for the same kind of thing, he'd say, "Oh, young master, tell us now you've not gone deaf or blind, and ease us all our worry." And it just has a very different boom, boom, boom feel to it, right? Because you haven't necessarily changed the content, but you've changed how it's organized metrically, okay? So, yeah. Okay, so I got a question from Morgan, and I think I need to go back to this. About N.K. Jemisin using spelled dialect in her story Sinners and Saints, and it has a longer title than that. Sinners, Saints, Dragons and Hates in the City Beneath Still Waters, which is a great story. So I think that you have several things going on here. One is there are words that are specific to this region that they have to be spelled a particular way. The way that we would spell gonna as G-O-N-N-A if we were going to have a kid use it in a context. Putting it down in that form indicates that that kid is actually a kid and using colloquial language. So we're not paraphrasing here. We're directly quoting what the kid's saying. Okay? If you're going to do that with, for example, the dialect of Louisiana, which is what N.K. Jemisin was working with, you have to make sure that you've done your research and have it exactly right. Right? You have to be, if you're not from there yourself, you have to be talking to people from there. You have to be, you know, checking your work. Okay? And you want to make sure that when people see it on the page, they say, yes, this is actually what this person would say, and not what some outsider thinks they might say. Okay? Right. So that's one of the things. The other thing is that there are words that members of particular social groups can use that members outside those groups cannot use. Okay? And the reason for that, as I see it, from a psycholinguistic perspective again, is that any time that you hear a word It comes with all of its context, and part of that context is who's saying it. Okay? Who's saying it is a very critical part of that context. So, it's not the same if you have a white person using certain words and you have a black person saying certain words, because you've already set part of the context, if you see my point. So if I use a word, if I were to use the N word, for example, which I would never do because, oh my gosh, right? But if I were to do that, I wouldn't just be accessing the pattern of activation of that word. I would actually be accessing all the instances of white people saying that word. And there are so many ugly instances of that, right? This is why a community can reclaim a word, because they can use it in internal, safe, or supportive contexts and overwrite the meaning that it has outside of those contexts, right? Make that meaning stronger. But you never can erase the fact that it existed in that other context. You see my point? It's a complicated issue, but that's the way I understand it from a psycholinguistic point of view. If you want to see me writing more about it, you should find my editorial called Not Just Semantics, which was in the May Analog this year, because I wrote specifically about that topic, about people talking about, oh, how it's just semantics, and how basically how the meanings of words can be complicated and co-opted and all that kind of thing. So if you want more depth on that, try to find that May Analog editorial. Or alternatively, I could send you a copy because you're my friend. But yeah, so anybody who's listening and wants to follow up is going to have to go through the analog. Okay?
On my coffee table somewhere.
Does that make sense? So as I said, there are two things going on there. Number one, you want to be very, very accurate, and you don't want to be doing it wrong, basically. And the other is it also has to do with who you are.
Right.
Yes, Che, and I think in fact you have a point. There was it was not all spelled out in dialect, as it were. It was particular words appeared in dialect, and I mean it's a decision-making process, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you want to make sure that you're not hitting the thing over the head, but you're doing it where it's necessary to convey specific types of social information about the speaker.
I mean, like, I've seen people do both, like, literally spell out, like, Scottish accents to get the whole... You know what I'm talking about. Like, they spell the accent. Like, I've seen that so many times, and some people who really, really know it, it's fine.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it just comes off as, like, this really cheesy, you know, terrible thing, and it's used, like so much. Like, I've seen whole things, just big chunks of dialogue, and just this spelled-out Scottish accent.
Yeah,
and I mean that's what I'm saying. Where like it wasn't spelled out like in that story.
Well,
it
I think
spelled like that, and because people have done that to like just general Southern accents as well, where they spell out like the drawl practically. You know what I mean? Where they spell out the accent, it like almost phonetically, like where things aren't spelled like correctly. To get like the sound of it going in your head, and that is just dear God, don't do that. It's terrible. No one likes it.
Well, I'm thinking there's a couple of things. One, what Juliet was saying is you have to really, really know it well to do it. But I think there's also having an ear for what's going to flow on the page and not overdoing it.
Yeah.
Just enough to give a flavor without overwhelming.
So if we talk for a second about the grammar of dialects, okay, it actually, dialects differ on a lot of different levels. the first thing that we might think of is the phonological level, or the way that words are pronounced. But that's not the only thing that differs, right?
No.
The vocabulary used, the lexicon used, differs critically. And I think that's one of the places where you can actually use dialect in a way that's not super clunky. You don't necessarily want to write out every word and reflect the pronunciation of the accent, but if you include words that are unique to that accent, lexically, then the feel will carry over, and you'll start to read those other words in the proper accent, because you're getting the information about where this person's from a different place. Does that make sense?
Like
and
if you
there's also sentence structure.
In the United States, whether you talk about soda pop or Coke.
Precisely.
Or pop versus soda.
Or soft drinks.
Yeah.
So those lexical differences are very important. There are also syntactic differences in the way that people will put together a sentence, right? And those are actually super useful. So don't just if you have the option of going for a dialect, don't just think about pronunciation. Think about basics of pronunciation, which you might be able to say, oh, well, I'm going to have another character remark on that person's pronunciation, right? But then you're also going to think about lexical differences, like the word can, yeah, exactly, or, lorry for a truck in the UK, right? Or, oh gosh, phrases that people use. So, no problem is a very American thing to say.
Yeah.
No worries is a very Australian thing to say. And I don't have to spell no worries in a strange way to get the feel of it to be Australian, because that is a very Australian phrase, right? And I will remark also that the things that you know that are quote-unquote dialect things are probably only the most stereotypical of the dialect things. So if you don't want to have your dialect come across as really clunky, then make sure that you've studied it so that you understand the way that sentences are made differently, the phrases that are used in certain kinds of contexts, right? And how these things are used, essentially. Because the word mate can be used in all kinds of contexts, right? And it can be positive, and it can be negative, and it can be all these different things. It's almost like dude, in a way, right? But very, small differences like that can really change the way that your world building and your dialects and such come across. So yeah. And I would say this is not the time or the place for me to go into how you can change grammar in order to make a person sound like they're a non-native speaker of English.
Okay. Too much stuff for world building.
So if you're working with world languages, a lot of the same things apply that we were just saying about dialects, right?
Okay.
If you're working with completely made-up languages, then you have to decide how that person actually talks and what it's like and why they would speak that way. And it can be everything from, metrical stuff, how their tumpty ums of their speech work out, to what words they use, to what metaphors they use, to what kinds of things they compare things to.
it's a non-native speaker is generally not going to speak entirely in direct translation from their native language, but the native language will have a lot of influence on how they think, how they structure a sentence, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
Like I was trying to do things for fantasy. I said I've got a character. If I ever write the thing, don't even ask about that. But the character is a kid from like a slummy ghetto in this fantasy world, and he's going to this very exclusive school. And so everybody who's from that city or who knows anything, can tell that he's like this ghetto kid. And I want, some of the characters, there's at least one, there's this other sort of middle-class girl, who I think would remark on, oh my God, you have to sound so slummy, kind of, thing. Like, and she's kind of a terrible person anyway.
So here, I'm bringing there just a few questions. Is he a person who is going to try to disguise the fact that he's from the slum? Or is he the type of person who would not be able to change his dialect for whatever reason?
I don't think he could do it. He's really talkative. He's really just talk. And he's not going to pay attention to how he's talking.
Right, I hear you. So what you want to make sure to do is not to make the dialect so heavy that it interferes with comprehension. Right?
Yeah.
Which can be quite challenging.
Yeah.
And also, one of the hazards of using spelling for dialect is that if you use a lot of alternate spellings, you can inadvertently make a person sound like they're less educated than they are. Because certain people are exceedingly well educated, but they have an accent. And so they're not going to speak the same way as a person who came from a slum with roughly the same accent. But there's going to be differences there, right?
Yeah.
And you don't want to accidentally start spelling things every which way and have your reader go, well, this person can't spell.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I was putting in 8 for a lot of things because I figured that was sort of a handy. But it's like his mother is foreign. She came to that city as a refugee. And still speaks the language, but probably only to her family. And she married a human. So she speaks mostly like the language of that city to them, and at home with her and her husband and her son. But she probably still has something of an accent. I don't know. It's ridiculous. Never mind. I can't. I'm not smart enough to be a writer. Not smart enough for anything.
Well, you know what? Here's the funny thing: is that whatever you don't think you're smart enough to do, you can probably find somebody to help you with, right? I mean, I've done plenty of stuff that I'm not smart enough to do.
Yeah.
And I just go and talk to somebody and go, hey, so, do you think it would be possible for an alien to be able to generate magnetic fields biologically without actually using a machine? And they're like,
and what would that organ look like?
You could do it this way, or you could do it this way. And I'm like, great! Now it works. Right?
Yeah.
So I mean, in a way, that's one of the reasons why it's so nice to be part of a writer community. Yeah.
My writer community of like the 3 other writers I actually know.
Oh, come on, Jay.
Who are all on the computer.
And even in non-writing contexts, there's a ton of grad students out there in various technical fields
Yeah.
that would love nothing better than to discourse about their favorite subject with you.
Yeah.
Precisely. Yeah. So, okay, so so are you guys feeling like we covered a lot of stuff at this point? I think, well, yeah. So I think there are a lot of things that we kind of tend to gravitate to, and they're easier to talk about. You know, dialects are easier to talk about than some of the other stuff here. But manners and what's considered important and what kind of behavior is considered important and what kinds of things we are considered polite if we mention versus what kinds of things we're considered rude if we mention. There are all kinds of things that have to do with discourse and social membership and all this kind of stuff that have deeply to do with world building, and I've usually visited them from another angle than grammar.
Yeah.
But I guess what I want to finish with is the idea that when we are told that you have to write a sentence in this particular way, it's not because if we don't follow the rule that we're in any danger of writing a sentence like colorless green ideas sleep furiously, which is a classic example that they give in linguistics for a sentence that really has no meaning, right?
Yeah.
But though it follows grammatical rules, we're not really in danger of doing that, right? We're not going to suddenly create a sentence that doesn't make any sense at all. What will happen, though, if we don't follow the rules that we're taught in school is that we'll sound like we don't belong in a school discourse community, right? And part of what we're doing in school is learning how to participate in school discourse, right? So that's why we want to follow the rules the way we follow them and not speak the way we speak to our friends on the playground or at home or in those kinds of contexts. And so one other thing to think about is when you're writing, those rules are going to be more at your disposal to do with as you will, right? You can say, okay, I'm going to have a very erudite group and they're going to speak in such and such a way. You can say, I have a colloquial group and they're going to use grammar in this other way that's perfectly fine and makes perfect sense, but is seen as marked for being impolite or being lower class or whatever it is by this other group who uses grammar a different way.
Yeah.
Right? And we've got that going on in spades in our world all the time.
Yeah.
All the time. So I think it's important to remember that grammar is not a set of rules so much as it's a very complex beast. And if you do something one way, it means one thing. And if you don't do it that way, you're not wrong. You just might be part of a different discourse community, or you might be unintentionally claiming membership with somebody that you really didn't intend to claim membership with. So watching out for your own grammar, I suppose, in writing is on one level, but it also, and this is related to the dialect question, looking at the way different characters use grammar differently within the context of this society, a secondary world society that you happen to be working with. So we're running over a little bit because I can stop talking. Any last questions?
Not for now.
No. I think what you're saying is to be aware of this stuff and to be in control of it in your writing.
Yes, right. You don't necessarily want to just follow the rules. You want to know what they are and what it means if you follow them and what it means if you break them in X, Y, or Z particular way. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yep. All right. Well, thank you guys for you guys for being here. I'm going to stop the broadcast.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, by the way, next week we have Henry Lian, who's coming to talk about his work. So I'm really excited about that. And the hangout, I think, will be at 3 o'clock, which is pretty much our standard time, and I hopefully won't have to change it because I don't like changing times on a guest. But it was so hot today, I wanted to make sure that I went and took my kids home. All right, so hopefully I will see you guys next week to talk with Henry, and thanks for being here.